Before the stars had even settled into their paths, Sector Nix had already been forgotten. But in the shadows of a fractured galactic ceasefire, one quiet mechanic named Kyle Draven would find a woman unlike any other, a wounded stranger whose silence screamed louder than war, whose touch would alter the course of both their lives. This is not a story of rescue. It's a story of rebirth. The wind in Sector Nix always smelled like melted plastic and burnt ozone. It was a place the rest of the galaxy had long since forgotten, a decaying scar on the outskirts of the failed neutral zones left behind after the ceasefire. Cracked ferrocrete roads snaked between collapsed shelters and hollow-eyed faces, smoke curled from smoldering trash fires, and overhead the sky was a colorless smear of static light. No birds, no sun, just the high whine of surveillance drones and the soft, constant hum of desperation. The walls surrounding the sector were rusted metal, patched with scavenged starship panels, some still faintly bearing the logos of long-dead planetary alliances. A few scrappy solar rigs stuck out at crooked angles, barely holding enough charge to run low-power heaters at night. There were no real homes here, just tarps, barrels, and the hollow shells of what used to be refugee pods. This was where the galaxy dumped those it didn't know what to do with anymore. The wounded, the exiled, the unwanted. And it was here that Kyle Draven first saw her. He had only come to deliver water filters, his usual supply route through the Outer Rim refugee zones. It was contract work, nothing special, but he was the type to keep things running long after everyone else stopped caring. He wasn't military, not anymore. Just an engineer with an old truck, a toolkit, and more ghosts than he cared to count. He hadn't planned to get out of the cab, but then he saw something strange out of the corner of his eye. Motionless, half-sunken in the sludge near one of the fire pits. At first he thought it was just another collapsed tent or the remains of a scavenged bot. But the shape had limbs delicate curled in on themselves, still. He slowed the truck, squinting through the dust-coated windshield. It was a woman, at least something shaped like one. He stepped down from the cab, boots squelching in the sludge. Around him, the locals, what few were still conscious in the haze, kept their distance. They glanced at her and looked away quickly, pretending she wasn't there. No one moved to help. No one even whispered. That alone told him something was very wrong. She was lying in the mud as if it had risen up and tried to swallow her whole. Her skin, where it wasn't caked in grime, was a deep smooth green with a faint shimmer, like moss and moonlight. Her face was angular, almost too symmetrical. Her ears were longer than a human's, curves slightly backward. Her hair so black, it gleamed almost blue, hung in ropes plastered against her face and neck. She looked like she'd been there for stellar rotations. Maybe orbit arcs, too. Still to be asleep, too broken to run. He crouched near her, careful not to spook her. "Hey," he said softly, his voice almost drowned out by the wind. "Can you hear me?" She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just kept staring. Not at him, but somewhere behind him, like she was watching something only she could see. He looked around. The other outcasts were doing their best to look busy, but none of them came close. A few muttered words and languages he half recognized. The tone was always the same disgust or fear. Kyle Draven studied her face. Her jaw trembled, barely noticeable. She was still alive. He shrugged off his coat and carefully laid it across her shoulders. Still no response. It wasn't until his fingers brushed her arm skin cold as stone that she moved. A tiny twitch. Almost nothing but her breath, hitched and her eyes widened for a fraction of a second. That was enough. She was still in there somewhere. Kale Draven slid his arms beneath her, lifting her gently. She didn't resist, didn't cry out. She just went limp against him, her body feather light. The coat slid off one shoulder, revealing a network of pale scars that looked like they'd been burned into her skin. He carried her past the silent stairs and muttered warnings back to the truck. No one tried to stop him. No one wanted her. The ride back to his Skyforge deep-frame unit was quiet. She didn't speak, didn't move, just curled against the seat, eyes half shut. Kale Draven kept glancing at her out of the corner of his eye, wondering what the hell he was doing. He wasn't the kind of guy to play hero, not anymore. But there was something about her, something painfully familiar, in the way she folded into herself like she was trying to take up less space than air. Like she expected to be hit, or worse. He remembered someone else who used to flinch like that. His sister, 12 years old, when the Akaran assault swept through their colony. She hadn't made it. That memory alone kept his hands steady on the wheel. By the time they reached his Skyforge deep-frame unit, a reinforced orbital shell with a patchy solar array and a generator that whined like it was dying. She was barely conscious. Kale Draven parked the truck, scooped her up again, and brought her inside. The air in his living space was dry and warmer than outside, though still sparse, functional. A workbench lined with spare parts, a heating unit buzzing in the corner, a makeshift cot tucked beneath the old comm relay station, the kind of place that looked like it was meant for machines, not people, but at least it was safe. He laid her down on the cot and stepped back. She didn't even seem to notice. There was mud everywhere on the floor, on her clothes, in her hair. He ran a hand through his own mess of brown curls, sighing. He set up the shower station rigged from an old ship decontamination unit and adjusted the water until it ran warm. Then he returned and gently knelt beside her. "I don't know if you understand me," he said, "but you need to get clean. The water's safe. You'll feel better." Still, nothing. He hesitated, then helped her up, one hand steady at her back. She moved like a broken puppet, jerky, fragile, barely capable of standing. He guided her to the shower stall, opened the curtain halfway, then turned away to give her privacy. She stepped under the water with all the will of a sleepwalker, and then a sob, sharp, uncontrolled, raw. Kale Draven froze. He heard the splash of her falling to her knees, the water pounding against her skin during this orbit. Arc, a deep, luminous green beneath the filth. The sobs kept coming, silent gasps that built into shaking breaths, as though the sensation of warmth was too much to bear. He didn't go in. He didn't speak. He just sat outside the curtain, cross-legged on the floor, and waited. After some time, the sobbing stopped. The water ran clear again. As she emerged, wrapped in a towel, her eyes were red, but no longer glassy. Her lips parted once like she might speak, but nothing came out. She walked past him, barefoot, dripping, sat on the cot, curled up, wrapped the towel tighter around herself. Kale Draven brought her a blanket, then turned down the lights. She watched him for the first time, not a full look, just a flicker of her gaze across his face. Her eyes were a strange, iridescent silver, like twin moons caught in the dark. He gave her a nod. "I'm Kale Draven," he said. "You don't have to say anything. You don't have to stay long. Just rest." He didn't ask where she came from. Didn't ask what they'd done to her. Didn't need to. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the walls. A drone, passed overhead, scanning, then moved on. Inside, Cale Draven sat at his workbench and pretended to tinker with something. He kept glancing over his shoulder at her. She didn't sleep, not really. But she didn't cry again either. And she didn't stop staring at the water on the floor as if part of her still couldn't believe it had touched her skin. She stayed like that for hours, silent, wrapped in warmth, and watching shadows that night. Cale Draven knew 3 things. She wasn't human. She wasn't safe here. And if anyone came looking for her, he'd lie through his teeth. The next morning, Sector Nix was quiet in that uneasy post-storm kind of way, like even the wind was holding its breath. Cale Draven stepped out into the gray light with a cup of half-warm synth coffee in hand, steam rising into the haze. The dust in the air tasted metallic, and the sky overhead was a murky smear. No real sun in sight. Clouds hung low, bruised with soot, across the crumbling boundary fence. The exile fringe stirred in sluggish movements. Figures huddled around makeshift fires, drones passing overhead like bored vultures, and a distant engine that never quite shut off. He sipped the bitter drink and let the silence settle. Inside, the girl was still asleep, or at least pretending to be. He'd found her curled on the cot when he woke, her towel replaced with one of his old flannel shirts, sleeves rolled up awkwardly over her wrists. She had cleaned herself again at some point during the night, quietly, carefully. There were damp footprints near the water unit, a used towel folded with surprising precision. But she hadn't run. He wasn't sure why that surprised him. He stepped back inside and set the cup on the table, watching her without making it obvious. Her breathing was even calm, but her body was curled tightly on one side as if bracing for impact. There were details about her that only hit him at this moment in the stillness. Her skin, presently that most of the grime was gone, was smooth and deep green, like moss polished by rain. It caught the light in a way human skin didn't, with an almost translucent sheen across her collarbones and cheeks. Her hair had dried into long, glossy waves that spilled over her shoulder, still tangled in places, but unmistakably elegant beneath the damage. She looked otherworldly, not monstrous, not alien in the way propaganda often painted outsiders, just wrong for this place. Too delicate for the filth and noise of Sector Nix, too alive. Cale Draven grabbed a ration bar and unwrapped it, the sound sharp in the quiet. Her eyes opened immediately, silver reflective, alert. He paused. Didn't mean to wake you. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. I brought some food, he added, holding the bar out, unthreatening. Not fancy, but it's clean. Real calories. She didn't move. Then after a long pause, she pushed herself up slowly, her shoulders hunched like she expected a blow. Her fingers brushed the edge of the blanket, and she hesitated there. Not for the food, for him. Cale Draven set the bar on the table between them and stepped back, gave her space. After a few seconds, she reached for it, fingers trembling, but steady enough to unwrap it on her own. She took a small bite, chewed slowly, then looked up again. Still nothing verbal. No sound. But she was watching him these days, really watching, like she was trying to work out who he was, what he wanted. If this kindness was just another trap, he didn't blame her for thinking that way. "You don't have to talk," he said gently, "but I figure I should let you know. You're safe here as much as anyone is in this dump." She blinked once. He sat on the edge of the workbench and leaned back, arms crossed. Let the quiet fill the room. She needed silence, not questions, not noise. Outside, a patrol drone passed low, scanning the area with a soft mechanical chirp. She flinched barely, but enough for Cale Draven to notice. although she was tracking sound, or maybe the tone of it. That mattered. He kept his voice soft, measured. "You got a name?" She didn't answer, but her hand tightened slightly around the ration bar. "That's okay," he said. "You don't have to give it to me." Another silence. Then she did something strange, something small, but meaningful. She reached up and touched the water unit's power switch, just a fingertip lightly brushing it. Dropped back into her lap. He raised an eyebrow. "The water." No response, but she did it again. Cale Draven realized what she was doing. "You like it?" he asked. The sound. She didn't nod, didn't smile, but there was a change in her posture, a softening, like a wire, loosening inside her chest. Something about water calmed her, or maybe it reminded her of something else, somewhere else. He made a mental note to keep it running more often. For the next few hours, they shared the same space without speaking. She stayed near the cot or the heater, always within a few feet of the exit, never turning her back on the door. Cale Draven worked on a broken filtration core at the bench, deliberately keeping his movements slow, predictable, letting her adjust to his rhythm. He didn't ask anything, not about the camp, or how long she'd been there, or what those scars meant. He knew better than to touch that wound too soon, but his mind raced. Who was she? Where had she come from? She wasn't just any refugee. They wouldn't be afraid of her like that, wouldn't shun her. They knew something. Was she dangerous? She didn't look dangerous. Fragile, yes, exhausted, but not a threat, unless she'd once been something else. And what if someone came looking? Cale Draven glanced out the window toward the distant shapes moving in the haze. He couldn't keep her here forever. Someone would notice. Someone always noticed. After that evening, as the light dimmed to a dull glow and the heater sputtered, she moved closer to him. Not much, just a few steps, but she did it on her own. She hovered by the corner of the workbench, watching his hands work the tools. Her gaze wasn't frightened, now more curious, focused. He looked up, surprised by how near she'd gotten. "You ever seen a pressure valve this old?" he asked casually, holding it up. She tilted her head. Still no words, but he thought maybe a flicker of interest passed through her eyes. He smiled a little. "Me neither. Looks like it came off a junk hauler from before the war." Her eyes narrowed slightly at the word, war. He didn't push it, just nodded, returning to his work. She stayed there until the heater clicked off for the night. She didn't sleep on the cot this time. She made a spot for herself in the corner near the water unit, wrapped in a blanket, curled tight. But this time, facing into the room, not away. He watched her for a long while. Then he shut the lights. And for the first time since she'd arrived, he heard something new. Not sobs, not gasps, just breathing, even measured, like someone who for the first time in a long time felt safe enough to simply exist. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. But one thought lingered. If she had been left out there to die, discarded, feared, unspoken, then someone powerful probably wanted her gone. And if that someone realized she was alive, they wouldn't stop until she wasn't. He'd already made his choice. He just didn't know what it was going to cost him yet. The rain had stopped by the time she emerged from the bathroom. For a few moments, Cale Draven didn't even realize she was standing there. He had been focused on the repair table, trying to coax life back into an ancient drone stabilizer, the kind built back when spaceflight still felt like a dream instead of a burden. The soft click of her bare feet against the floor pulled him from his work. It wasn't loud, barely a sound at all. But in the stillness of that dim little Skyforge deep-frame unit, it landed like thunder. He turned, expecting to see her curled up near the heater again, wrapped in a blanket, limbs tight and wary as always. Instead, she stood just outside the bathroom doorway, and she looked different. No more than that. She looked alive, clean. For the first time since he'd found her half buried in the mud and wreckage of Sector Nix, she no longer looked like a ghost. The transformation was almost surreal. Her skin, during this orbit arc, free of dirt and blood, shimmered faintly under the overhead lights, a deep, flawless green with a delicate luminescence, as if light lived beneath its surface. The silver scars, scattered along her arms and collarbone, once hidden under grime, caught the glow, in fine, ghostly threads, like a map drawn across her body in starlight. Her hair was no longer a tangled, matted mass. It spilled down her back, in long, gleaming waves of black damp at the ends, some strands clinging to her neck and shoulders. She wore one of his long shirts, the hem brushing just above her knees, the sleeves rolled and clumsily buttoned at the cuffs. It hung loose on her frame, but somehow didn't look ill-fitting, just soft, human. But it wasn't the shirt, or her skin, or the way the light wrapped around her like it had missed her presence. It was her eyes. She was looking at him directly, steady, not flinching, not retreating into herself like before, and Cale Draven couldn't look away. For a moment, everything else fell away. The low hum of the power unit, the static from the outer comms, the hiss of the waterline all faded into silence. It was just her standing in the half-light of his relay citadel, rain-washed and fragile. And he blinked, suddenly aware he was staring. His voice caught in his throat and he coughed, looking away like he'd touched something too hot. Didn't mean to gawk. Just, you look better. Much better. He turned back to the workbench, but his hands had gone useless. Tools blurred in his vision. Every nerve in his body was telling him to glance back to check if she was still there. She hadn't moved. He could feel her gaze, like sunlight on the back of his neck. When he finally risked another look, she was closer. Not much. Maybe 2 steps, but enough to make his chest tighten. She walked slowly, her feet silent against the floor. She stopped beside the table and let her fingers hover above the drone parts, scattered across the surface. She didn't touch anything, just studied the mess of wires, sensors, and cracked alloy plating with quiet curiosity. He tried to focus on what he was doing, replacing a fried capacitor, but her nearness made it impossible to think clearly. Her scent, clean earthy with something faintly floral, rose with the heat of the room and wrapped around him like a memory he couldn't place. She pointed at the central panel of the drone, her finger just an inch above the casing. "You've worked with these before?" he asked, keeping his voice low and steady. She didn't answer, but her gaze remained fixed on the drone's internal matrix, her expression concentrated. She raised her hand, mimed a motion, twisting her fingers like she was screwing something in. Cale Draven followed her cue and flipped the housing to reveal the core smart. He muttered, genuinely impressed. "Most people wouldn't know how this opens. Hell, I didn't know until I broke 2 of them." He watched her, studying the way her lips pressed together in quiet focus, how her eyes flicked between components like she was recalling blueprints burned into memory. He didn't just guess she remembered. "You're an engineer," he said, more to himself than her. "Or you used to be." Still no words, but the silence between them no longer felt empty. It was starting to feel like something else. Something chosen. He stood brushing his hands off on a rag and reached into one of the storage drawers for a spare casing. "You want to try?" he asked, holding the part out to her. She hesitated, eyeing the object in his hand as if it might vanish. Then she stepped forward and took it from him. Her fingers brushed his in the process. Brief, unintentional, but enough to send a ripple through his chest. Her hands were warm, steady, surprisingly delicate for someone who had endured whatever horrors left her in Sector 8, abandoned and unloved. She turned the piece over in her palm, then knelt beside the workbench, tucking one leg beneath her. Cale Draven sat across from her, careful not to crowd the space.